Author POV. The morning sun barely filters through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the pristine office of Jungkook, CEO of one of the city's most prestigious firms. Papers, meticulously arranged, lie on his desk, notes, calculations, and key data for today's pivotal presentation. His piercing gaze flicks over the documents, a testament to countless late nights and uncompromising dedication. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps breaks his focus. Enter Y/N, his secretary, balancing a stack of folders, a pen clenched between her teeth, and a cup of coffee held precariously in one hand. Jungkook sighs inwardly, a familiar frustration bubbling up as he watches her hasty entrance. She's been his secretary for months, and though she's bright and hardworking, there's a clumsy, almost chaotic energy that surrounds her. "Good morning, sir," she says, her voice muffled as she attempts to set everything down, hands juggling between the coffee and files. Jungkook barely nods, his focus shifting back to the papers. Just as he returns to reviewing a report, he hears the gasp, a tiny, horrified sound that freezes him. He looks up, and his worst fear materializes before him, Y/N's coffee tilting, spilling onto the perfectly arranged documents, the dark liquid seeping across the carefully typed words. A tense silence fills the room as Jungkook's eyes narrow, his expression hardening. He clenches his jaw, his tone icy. "Are you serious right now, Y/N?" Her face pales, and she stammers, I'm so sorry, Mr. John. "I didn't mean to." She frantically reaches for tissues, dabbing helplessly at the soaked pages. Jungkook inhales deeply, attempting to quell his frustration. But the sight of his hard work drenched in coffee is too much. "This meeting is crucial, Y/N. I've spent hours preparing, and you just ruined the whole thing. You are useless, Y/N. He stops, his words biting, yet somewhere in his chest, a pang of guilt pierces through. Her eyes start to glisten with unshed tears, but she quickly looks away, muttering another apology before rushing out of the office, and clutching her remaining papers. He watches her leave, jaw still clenched, yet something twists uncomfortably in his chest. He knows he was harsh, maybe too harsh, but he forces himself to ignore the impulse to call her back, to offer even a hint of comfort. She's just his secretary, after all. But the ache doesn't ease. In truth, from the moment Y/N had walked into his office on her first day, he'd felt something shift. There was a lightness she brought with her, a softness in her eyes, an unguarded kindness in her smile, a clumsy warmth that filled the sterile coldness of his office. He noticed it all, despite his best efforts. But every time his mind drifted to thoughts of her, he would pull himself back, each time more determined to keep his distance. He couldn't afford distractions, least of all one like Y/N. He'd been burned before, and he wasn't about to let his guard down for anyone, not even for the one person who seemed to pull at every defense he had carefully constructed. His past heartbreak was a lesson he'd vowed never to forget. Relationships, attachments, they were risks he wasn't willing to take again. He had built a life, a reputation, and a company with cold detachment as his armor, and he couldn't allow his heart to get in the way. And yet, with Y/N, it was different. Her clumsiness, her unguarded laughter, the way she tried so hard to please him despite his often cool exterior, it all seemed to inch its way past his walls. But each time he found himself softening, each time he caught himself staring a moment too long or holding onto her smile in his memory, he forced himself to retreat. He would remind himself, sternly, that she was just his secretary. Nothing more. Jungkook clenches his jaw, shaking his head as if he could physically rid himself of these unsettling thoughts. Now isn't the time for sentimentality, he tells himself firmly, ignoring the pang of regret still lingering. He'd put his heart on the line once, only to see it shattered. He wouldn't make that mistake again, no matter how much Y/N's presence tempted him otherwise. Y/N's POV. The moment I step out of his office, the tears spill over, hot and relentless, blurring my vision. I race down the hall to the bathroom, locking myself in a stall. How could I be so clumsy? How could I let this happen? The scene replays in my mind, my hand slipping, the coffee splattering across his work. I know how hard he worked on those papers, how many hours he poured into them, and now, because of me, they're ruined. But it's not just my mistake that stings. It's the way he looked at me, cold, angry as if I were nothing more than a careless nuisance. His words echo in my mind, each one sharp and cutting, laced with disappointment and irritation. I'd heard about his reputation, about how he's hard on his employees, but this was different. It felt personal, like he wanted me to feel small. And that hurt more than I care to admit. I press a hand to my chest, struggling to catch my breath. Why does his opinion matter so much? I can feel the anger building inside me, mingling with the hurt. I've done nothing but work hard since the day I started, trying to meet his impossible standards, and putting up with his cold attitude, his dismissive glances, and his criticism. And yet, one mistake, a mistake anyone could have made, and he tears me down like this. After a few moments, I take a deep, shuddering breath, wiping the tears from my eyes. I can't let him see me like this, can't let anyone see me falling apart. I need to stay professional and keep my head up, no matter how much his words sting. I've worked too hard to let one moment of weakness define me. As I straighten up and look in the mirror, a part of me still aches. Why do I care so much about what he thinks? I don't want to admit it, but there's a part of me that respects him and admires his dedication, and his intelligence. Maybe, just maybe, I'd hoped he'd see something in me, too, something beyond my role as his secretary. But that's a foolish thought. I steel myself, forcing the feelings down, locking them away with the same care I put into organizing his files. I'll get through this. I'll prove to him, and to myself, that I'm capable, that I won't be broken by one mistake. And if he can't see my worth, then that's his problem, not mine. Taking one last steadying breath, I smooth down my skirt and head back to the conference room. I won't let him, or anyone else, make me feel small. Back in the conference room, I force myself to focus on the presentation, steadying my voice and holding my head high. Jungkook sits at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, though I can feel his gaze on me. I ignore it, determined to stay professional despite the tension still lingering between us. As I go through each slide, I notice Mr. Kim, Jungkook's business partner, watching me intently, but his interest seems to be less on my presentation and more personal. His eyes linger a little too long, and his attention drifts from the content of my talk to, well, me. It's uncomfortable, but I keep going, staying focused. Out of the corner of my eye, I see Jungkook shift, his jaw tightening as he notices Mr. Kim's stare. The tension in the room thickens, and I can feel Jungkook's gaze becoming sharper, almost possessive. But I push through, ignoring everything except the work in front of me. As I finish, Mr. Kim gives an approving nod and leans forward, flashing me a charming smile as he compliments my presentation. "You've done an excellent job, Y/N, he says, holding my gaze a little too long. "In fact, I'd love to hear more, perhaps over dinner?" I'm caught off guard, glancing quickly at Jungkook, who looks anything but pleased. His jaw clenches, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stares down Mr. Kim. Before I can answer, Jungkook interjects, his voice cold and final. "Unfortunately, she's busy. We have some additional work to go over." Mr. Kim raises an eyebrow, clearly not expecting the interruption, but I decide to take control. Hurt and frustration flare up again as I remember how Jungkook treated me earlier. I smile politely at Mr. Kim, ignoring the silent tension from Jungkook's side of the table. "Actually, I'd be glad to join you for dinner, Mr. Kim." As soon as I replied, I could feel Jungkook's eyes shift to me. I looked over him bravely. "But not anymore, I guess." His eyes flash with something darker, something dangerous.